Hello and welcome. My name is Racio Jr. and I'm a library supervisor over volunteer services for a public library in Arizona. And I'm also a graduate student with Valdosta State University studying library and information science. I graduate in December of 2024. Today I'll be discussing the positives and the challenges associated with running a volunteer program for a public library. But first, let us discuss what volunteer services is all about. Volunteers provide their time and energy to support the library's mission. In many ways, they are like employees in that they perform tasks related to the library, but rather than accepting money, they are accepting praise. Volunteer services is the management of the public library's volunteers. Providing opportunities for the community to volunteer is also a service we provide to the community. Nicole and Johnson said that the chance for people to contribute their time and interest as volunteers is a way the library acknowledges that this is a community library. And this is incredibly true. Volunteers often demonstrate the very best of the community, and they help the library to become a literal hub of inspiration. So what does a library supervisor over volunteer services do? Well, a supervisor of volunteers primarily manages the volunteer program. This includes identifying volunteer positions, recruiting volunteers, onboarding volunteers, supervising volunteers, and praising volunteers. Some libraries, like the library I work at in Arizona, have a dedicated position to manage their volunteer program. That would be me. For larger libraries, this makes sense. In my volunteer program, I have over 300 volunteers enrolled and about 150 currently active volunteers. As you can imagine, it would be impossible to supervise all of the volunteers if I had several other job duties. For many libraries, however, especially rural and small libraries, this person tasked with supervising the volunteers can be someone with other job duties. It doesn't have to be a volunteer supervisor. You do want to make sure that this person is eligible to supervise given their position and title. Bird and Crumpton note that a dedicated staff member or members assigned to this role are pivotal to a strong volunteer program. This gives the volunteers a point person in the library and a person to report to with their questions or concerns. And this is very true. You need to select at least one direct contact for volunteers, and the reason why is because they need to know exactly who to go to with any problems, questions, or concerns they may have. Once you have identified an employee to lead the volunteer program, you must start to consider the tasks that the volunteers will be doing. First, you absolutely do not want volunteers to be brought on and have nothing to do. They will become disengaged and it will be problematic later. Additionally, you do not want volunteers to take away from the actual paid employees. It's a very careful balancing act. As Nicole and Johnson point out, any volunteer program must have the prior approval of the staff and governing body of the library, and that volunteers should not supplant or displace established staff. This is very important for two reasons. First, you do not want to anger staff at the library. They will blame the volunteers, and this can cause problems with your overall volunteer program later. Second, you do not want stakeholders to replace paid staff with volunteers. Volunteers and a volunteer program should supplement a library's staff, not take away from it. This is why it's so important to identify the positions that volunteers can help in. You have to find the right balancing act of aiding the library's needs without overwhelming the library with free labor. And again, this is a very careful balancing act. In my experience, I have created a form for library staff to fill out to request a volunteer. As you can see the form on the right side of this slide, the form helps me to determine the workload related to the request and if it's enough to actually warrant a volunteer, or maybe it warrants several volunteers. It also creates narrow and specific positions for volunteers, and it helps me to recruit volunteers later. Once I've captured all of the necessary information that I need to recruit a volunteer or recruit for a position, I then create what I call a volunteer activity description, or a VAD. This is, in the simplest terms, just a job description. As you can see on the right, this is a VAD that I created for a program called Tail Wagging Tails, and it just lists out specifics about the position. I've taken inspiration from various job descriptions and postings for a variety of similar positions, and then I rewrite them to fit the assignment. For example, I knew that I needed volunteers to help with the circulation department doing page-like duties. Thus, I looked to the library's page job descriptions and edited it to fit the specific needs of the request that I had received. Using the job description or VAD that you've created, you need to somehow make it known to the public that you are recruiting volunteers for specific positions. There are many free and paid places you can do this. You can post a flyer in the library, post it on the library's website, include it in the library's newsletter or e-newsletter, post it on the library's social media. You can also use various websites such as volunteermatch.org, which offers both a free and paid option. I've used both and have found volunteers by both means. It is in my experience that getting volunteers or getting people who are interested in volunteering is not the hard part, but instead you have to make sure that they are a good fit to not only the duties related to the position, but you also want to make sure that they're a good fit with the staff and volunteers you already have established in the organization. The easiest way to get to know a volunteer is by having a volunteer interview. I use this as an opportunity to discuss the volunteer's background and how it relates to the position. There are numerous ways you can go about doing this. The most important concept here is that you need to make sure that you adjust the interview to fit the needs of the position. For instance, not that long ago, I needed a sewing volunteer to help with our sewing programs. Naturally, interviewing for someone to sew is the priority. So of course, my interview questions related to paging duties simply wouldn't work. Instead, I asked the potential sewing volunteer information about sewing, patterns, etc. I also asked her about her background, her experience with kids, and I used all this to just get a general sense of what makes them want to volunteer. This interview can be as casual or as rigid as you wish to make them. I approach it as a general conversation, though. Some of the questions that I ask include, tell me about yourself. What motivates you to volunteer? How does your previous experience influence your decision making? As Bird and Grumpton note, that although the process of interviewing volunteers applicants may seem daunting to volunteer coordinators due to the time restraints, interviews will allow the library to ensure that the applicant has the skills and abilities to perform the functions needed to determine what a potential volunteer may be best suited for. During the interview process, you can access the potential volunteer skills, demeanor, and temperament to verify that they are a good fit into the workplace that you already have established. Usually, if by the end of the interview I have decided to hire them, I then provide them with an application to complete. If I know by the end of the interview that I will not be hiring them, I will thank them for their time and let them know I'll be in touch. Then I send a thank you but not thank you email to them. Once you have interviewed them and you've decided that you want to hire them, you then need to onboard them. I need to be very clear here. Onboarding is probably the most important component of any new position, including positions in the volunteer program. The first step to onboarding is getting the potential volunteer to fill out an application. Depending on your municipality and on your library, you may already have a volunteer application that is used in other departments. If not, you will need to create one. You want your application to include various things like personal details, like the name, address, and phone number of your volunteer. And then you also want it to include any mandated information your municipality requires, such as legal right to work in the U.S. This specific question is on the application that I use, and we require an affirmative response as our volunteers in our program are covered under workers' compensation. You also need to make sure you have an emergency contact information from your volunteer, and I personally like to have a brief statement from the volunteer on why they want to volunteer. After hired, training the volunteer is very important. You can do this with a new volunteer orientation. Many organizations, libraries included, include an orientation with their new volunteers. Some organizations have online training videos that individuals must watch and pass a quiz on. Others have in-person orientations. Regardless of the form, orientations are critical to the important development of your relationship with a volunteer. Just like any new volunteer any new employee would receive new information, you want your new volunteer to as well. That you want them to receive information regarding their organization and work environment, as well as specific job-related information. This is very important for your volunteers to know because you want them to feel at home and welcome in their new position at the library. In addition, this moment gives you an opportunity to have the volunteer sign important paperwork. Depending on your organization, this may vary, but most importantly, you want to protect the library. As Nicole et al. Note, library volunteers are a potential legal liability, but no more so than library employees. If library personnel take the time to provide safety training for volunteers and have volunteers sign a form that outlines library policies, risks can be minimized. And you absolutely need to make sure that you're minimizing risks. In my volunteer program, I require my volunteers to sign not only a non-disclosure, but also a statement saying that they have understood the rules and components laid out in the new volunteer orientation I provide them in person. Maintaining a volunteer program includes doing work beyond just recruiting and hiring and orienting volunteers. You must also supervise them during the program. This includes addressing concerns, answering questions, continuously training them as policies and procedures change, and keeping them well stocked with the supplies they need. In addition to the day-to-day management of the program, a good volunteer coordinator will also collect statistical information, such as tallying hours they volunteered. This sort of information is helpful to stakeholders when promoting the program. You must also keep volunteer files up to date. This too will depend on your own city or town's policies. In Arizona, for instance, I must keep volunteer records for 5 years after the volunteer stops volunteering or after the last contact with them. There are various record retention laws throughout the country, and depending on your state and municipality, you'll need to make sure you adhere to them. The best way to go about doing this is to work with HR and discuss with them what they do with their employee files, because what you're doing with your volunteer files almost always mimics what is required out of the employee files, because volunteers are very similar to employees. Finally, we get to discuss what I consider the best part of a volunteer program and probably my most favorite component of it, and that is getting to praise your volunteers. Graff et al. Note that volunteers may lose motivation over time if they do not feel that their work is appreciated or if they do not see the results of their labor. It is important to recognize and reward volunteers for their contributions. I do this in a multi-pronged approach. First, all volunteers are eligible at any time to receive a small thank you award. Usually this is a $5 gift card. I allow staff anywhere of any type to recognize any volunteer for any reason. All they have to do is send me a statement saying why they deserve this award. I then present that award to the volunteer in a very laid back, low stakes manner. I just walk up to them, hand them it, congratulate them, read them the statement, and give them the gift card. Second, I always make sure there's food available for my volunteers. There's always food, candy, beverages available for all volunteers at all times. It is amazing the amount of work people do for a single piece of chocolate. Chips, cooked chocolates, and water is always available, and every once in a while I'll bring in donuts, bagels, or coffee just to really keep them motivated. Third, there's an annual volunteer event that I do. This usually happens in April to coincide with Volunteer Appreciation Week. Here, the volunteers are fed and praised. Speakers from throughout the city come in to praise the volunteers and discuss how their efforts impact the library. In addition, this is a great opportunity to give out various awards. You can apply to be a qualifying organization for the Presidential Volunteer Service Awards. This requires the volunteer supervisor to pass a written test on the rules through the federal program. It is free to join, free to take the test. However, the awards themselves do cost money, but there is nothing better than giving a volunteer a medal from the president. In addition, you can also make up awards and give them out, such as worked the most hours this year, or really anything. This is your opportunity to be creative. Volunteers want to be praised, and you want to praise them. They're doing such good work for us, and they're doing it for free. They're providing us with free labor, and it's really important that we honor, respect, and praise the volunteers for all of their work. Well, I want to thank you for tuning in today. If you have any questions, feel free to reach me. My name is Ray Ceo Jr. again, and I can be reached at raceo@valdosta.edu. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a great day. Here are the references used throughout this presentation.